study it. My goal this morning is to teach, but not to be the ultimate teacher, because I believe you can teach and you can illuminate and you can speak in ways that I never could. And so I pray that my voice doesn't drown out yours, and that you show us specific things in our life that can be affected once they are exposed to the truth of your word. We ask this of you in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so we're in Daniel, and we're going to be in Daniel 3 today. We started that a little bit last week, and just so that we're on the same page, whether you were here or not, you remember that Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and you remember Daniel has interpreted this dream, this vision that ultimately God had given Nebuchadnezzar of what was going to happen in the not just years to come, but as history unfolds, and about this successive development of kingdoms, the rise and fall of these various kingdoms, and ultimately how the Lord himself is going to bring crumbling and crashing down all the kingdoms of the world to establish his own. All right, so we finished that, and do you remember what Nebuchadnezzar's response is? He's had this vision, and in the vision, what was it that he saw? It was a big... What was it? It was a statue. And so what does Nebuchadnezzar, just strangely, out of the blue, what does he decide to build? Well, a statue. And is it a big statue? Yeah, how tall was it, remember? So it's 90 feet tall. And anything else that's particular about it? Yeah, it's covered in gold, and it was erected on the plains of Dura. So you pick a flat spot, make it taller than probably anything else in the entire kingdom, cover it in gold. This thing was a spectacle. And it wasn't simply that this thing was created and crafted and placed and dedicated, but what came with the creation of this statue? Yeah, so people were supposed to bow down and worship this thing. When were they supposed to do that? Was there a set time of day? Yeah, it was any time you hear, there was a whole series of instruments. And when you hear that, well, it's time to stop, drop, and bow. And you're going to effectively worship this image of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Was that kind of a suggestion? It was the law. And so if there's a law, typically there's consequences if there's violation of the law. And what was the violation, or the consequence of the violation of that law? Specifically, how would you be killed? Yeah, so you get tossed into the furnace. All right, so that's kind of where we left things last week. So we're going to pick up starting in verse 8 of chapter 3. So Daniel chapter 3. And what we're thinking about today is this. So here's kind of the main idea. If you take seriously your walk and your relationship with the Lord, you are going to get pushback. There is going to be opposition in varying forms, in varying levels of intensity that you will receive. Now, if you just want the whole Christian experience to be a game and the whole pretend act, then there's no pushback. But if living for Christ is going to be real, and it's going to be meaningful, and it's going to be how God wants it to be, well, then you have to remember you're operating in a culture that's headed in the opposite direction. And so they are going to be, in varying ways, pushing back on you. So today we're going to be thinking about bracing for that impact. All right, so starting in verse 8, we read that some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue." In fact, it seems that anytime, if there's music played, somebody turns on the radio. If there's a jingle on TV, bow down again. So anytime there's music, you fall down and worship this thing. Verse 11, whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon. Can't you just hear the snide tone? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men have ignored you. They've ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Verse 13, then in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And the king asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you'll immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you set up. All right, so that takes us through the first half of the story. All right, here are some guys that are absolutely getting pushback, right? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these are part of the group that when the Babylonians conquered the people of God, they have brought some of them back, and they're trying to utilize them, repurpose them, re-educate them, and you've got Daniel, we've already spent some time looking at, but now the focus is shifting, at least for this segment, to three of his close friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're getting absolute pushback because they're taking really seriously this whole idea of following the Lord, understanding that he's the only God, that he's the only one worthy of worship. Everything else is, you hear about fake news, this is just a fake God. I mean, this is just nonsense, and we're not going to be a part of that. And because of that, there is real pushback. In fact, there is state-mandated pushback because the law says when you hear music, you bow down and worship the statue of the king. And they decided, okay, we're not going to do this. All right, I think based on what we see here and as the passage continues to unfold, there's some lessons that we ought to get in our mind pretty straight. And here's the first one. You may have a friend in Jesus, but maybe nowhere else. You may have a friend in Jesus, or let me restate it. You have a friend in Jesus, but maybe nowhere else. And obviously that's an appeal to a song that you're familiar with, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, All Our Sins and Griefs to Bear. You know that. But understand this, that as people, we are wired for friendship, aren't we? We just are. And we're wired for human interaction and the establishment and the building of relationships. And hopefully everyone in this room has friends. You may not have a million friends. In fact, if you're on Facebook, you probably have a lot more friends than you actually have friends, right? And I hate that status because there's some people that you would say, I would like to, I just want to see the stuff that you post, but we're not really, is there like an acquaintance level? Like I know you, I can be nosy about your stuff. You can be nosy with mine. But we all have friends. And in that group of individuals that we would say are friends, we've got a smaller group that we would say those are my real, true friends, right? And some of you have had some friends that you've known for a long time. Anybody have some friends that you've known essentially since elementary school that you're thick as thieves with? Oh, so there's a few of you. And hopefully you realize that that's a rare thing. It really is. And I hope that you don't take that for granted because you shouldn't. Those are, I mean, for everything else there's MasterCard, but I mean those are a rare, special gift. We're wired for this. We want this. We appreciate this. We enjoy this. We value this. All of those things. And because of that, because we want, desire, we're wired for, we need, we value, we appreciate, because we do all these things, we tend to lean on our friends to varying extents, don't we? Sure we do. And so if it's been a really bad day or there's a really tough circumstance that you're going through, you may lean on them, even if it's just to talk to them and just say, hey, this is what's going on in my life, or this is somebody that you can call and say, hey, would you pray for me, or what do you think about this, to get counsel from? And so we lean on our friends. And hear me in this, I'm not suggesting that we should not do that. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But we have to remind ourselves of this, that at the end of the day, our friends are still what? What are they? They are people. And do you know what all people are? Including us, including me, including you? We're a bunch of screw-ups. We just are. And if we are all a bunch of screw-ups, what does that say about our ultimate reliability? It says that it's suspect, and that at some point, in some form or fashion, we will operate in such a way as to disappoint those even that are dearest to us. And it's likely that you have had friends, even close friends, that you could talk to them about anything. But in some form or fashion, maybe it is that they have disappointed you. Maybe it was that there was a need that you were going through that they couldn't help you with, or maybe they didn't respond how you wanted. I'm just telling you, you have had friends that have disappointed you. And we need to remind ourselves that's just how it works, because it's built into the DNA of people. Because of the existence of original sin, we are all screw-ups. And because of that, as dependable as we are not infinitely dependable. As trustworthy as we are not infinitely trustworthy. And every one of us in this room will disappoint someone. And everyone in this room has people that you are leaning on that will disappoint you. Now, in terms of what's going on in this passage, I want you to pay attention to the fact that there are some people that are effectively letting down, disappointing and failing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that really shouldn't. Who would you say is disappointing them that really shouldn't? The first one is back in verse 8. So I'll go ahead and tell you, the first group is this group of Chaldeans. I don't believe, no, we talked about this very briefly last week at the end. First of all, with respect to Chaldeans, that's a reference to who? To people from Babylon. So these are native Babylonians. And they are going to the king, and they're instigating, aren't they? They're stirring the pot, and they're essentially saying to the king, hey, these outsiders, they're not getting with the program. They're not following the law. They don't respect you. They are not assimilating. They're not acting like one of us. But who specifically do you think are these just random native Babylonians? Who do you think these people are? I think so. It's these. I'm going to put it in this category, the part of the wise men. So that you've got, that have been already mentioned. So you've got the sorcerers, the astrologers, the mediums, and all these people that are operating in very dark spiritual places that have been useful in the king's service before. I believe it's this group that is saying and putting this bug in the king's ear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's the question. Are these guys who should have been supporters and been there for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Why should they have been supporters? Because they were part of the team that was championed and led by the team captain, Daniel, that spared their lives. Hopefully you remember, and these guys should have remembered, there was an actual law, an edict signed by the king that says, you guys, all of you, you die. And were it not for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, every one of them would have been dead. So these people should have been Team Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You'd have thought that they would have been operating, trying to keep all of this hush-hush. We're not going to draw any attention to this. But that's exactly what they are not doing. So these are people who should have been friends, but were they? No, absolutely not. So they're not friends. There's another instance in this, in what we've already read, somebody that should have been a friend to these guys that wasn't. Yeah, so you've got the king himself. So King Nebuchadnezzar should have been a friend. Why should he have been a friend? Well, they were part of the team that answered this lingering, vexing question that Nebuchadnezzar had. I mean, because you remember, he's had this vision, he's had this dream that is so unsettling that he wakes up every day thinking, this means something. There's significance to this. I have no idea what it is. And he's experiencing sleeplessness, he's experiencing anxiety, he's experiencing all of this because of this vision that he has had, and he doesn't know what it means. And these three guys are part of the team, again, spearheaded, led by Daniel, that brings solution to the challenge. In fact, in many ways, not only did they provide the solution, but the solution kind of painted Nebuchadnezzar in a favorable light, didn't it? Because how did it put him in a favorable light? Yeah, it put him as the head of the statue in this dream, and the head was made of gold. And so if there was anyone personally in the kingdom that should have been advocates of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you'd have thought it was the king. Absolutely. Yeah, and that was one of the things that we talked about last week, that people's expressions of faith, we need to, it's kind of like what Reagan said with Gorbachev, you need to trust but verify. And that we don't need to overstate or over-respond to what it is, to faith expressions that people make, because they may be far less than anything that is actual faith or complete. So this is a guy that should have been a friend, but again, he's absolutely not. In your life thus far, it is likely that there have been some supposed friends of yours or actual friends of yours who have disappointed you, who have failed you. That's going to be true for all of us. I remember a person that I knew that Caroline had warned me for some time. And she said, listen, you need to be careful how you act around this person. They are not, I'm just telling you, they are not your friend. They are not your friend. And I didn't argue with her. I just ignored her. But the truth is, she was right. This person wasn't. The person wasn't my friend. And I discovered that I was married to a prophet. But in truth, that type of thing shouldn't come as a surprise. And listen, if it does for you, especially at this stage in life, let me just tell you that it shouldn't. And going forward, you may have just a few of you raise your hands about having some lifelong friends, going back all the way to elementary school that you have known for decades. Again, that's wonderful. But just bear in mind that every one of those people is going to disappoint you. Even the people that you have done great things for, that maybe, potentially, it is the case, these guys saved their lives. They literally owed their lives in part to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what are they doing? They're turning on them. Do not be surprised as you take seriously the whole prospect of living for and walking with God that you're going to get pushback from people that were supposed to have been your friend. Because you have a friend in Jesus, but sometimes you may discover you don't really have one anywhere else. Here's a second thought I want you to get, and that's this. Know which chopping blocks are worth your head. Know which chopping blocks are worth your head. So look back at, excuse me, I'm wrong chapter. Look at verse 16. So these three are responding to the king, and they say, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But if he doesn't rescue us, we still want you to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you set up. All right. These guys are willing to put their head on the line, right? Literally to put their head on the chopping block. So, that's important. But it's also important to pay attention to what they say, because they're intentional in what they express. There's some things, they're not saying that they're attempting and willing to die for a couple of things. What are they not willing to die for? It's pretty clear they are willing to risk their lives and even give their lives for something. But they're not willing to give their lives for just anything. In fact, they indicate some stuff in their statement that they're not attempting to give their life for. I'm sorry, somebody say, I'm sorry, Grace. Yeah, they're not willing they say they're not willing to give their life for the king. No, certainly they're not willing to do that. But even on a spiritual basis, they are not willing to do that. Let me see if I can guide you in this sense. They are not willing. Let me see how I wrote it. Well, if I could write, I can't. All right, so that says they are not willing to die to settle the argument as to whether God is real. Now, they know that He is, but whether or not the king agrees with that or not is whether they win that argument in the king's mind. Are they willing to die for that? No, they're not risking their life for that. They're also not risking and willing to their lives to prove that God can save them. Are they? No, because in fact they emphatically say, well, in fact, let me back up. In verse 17, they said, if the God we serve exists, then He can rescue us. So they're stating what their belief is. But whether the king subscribes to that or not doesn't really matter. And so they're just so that the king might believe, they're not just saying, oh, okay, we'll just die for that. They said, but if the God we serve exists, we believe sincerely He can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and He can rescue us from your power. But, verse 18, what do they say? Even if He doesn't, we're not turning. Now, there are some people over the years, some lunatics, that have essentially kind of dared God with their stupidity. Said, you try to use themselves as an object lesson. I can't think necessarily of a good actual example, but I'm certain that historically there have been multiplied instances where someone would have essentially said, I'm going to prove to you, and I'm willing to die to prove that God can save me, only to discover that God did not save them. And it was not an example of the lack of God's power, but an abundance of their foolishness. They're not saying, I'm putting my head on the line just to show that God can save me. I'm not trying to come up with a little trap, a little litmus test. Or so I'm going to put my head on the chopping block, and so if you raise the axe, and so if God, because I believe that God can save me, so the axe head's going to fall off, and you're just going to whack me in the head with a stick. They're not doing that. In fact, they're taking completely out of the question whether or not God is going to save them. They're saying, I don't know. I know that He can. I believe that He has the ability. Whether He does or doesn't, I don't know. But regardless, I'm not willing to bow down to you. They are willing to face and experience death for one reason. Why ultimately are they willing to put their head on the line? That they are not going to bow down to anything other than God Himself. They're just not. It is important to remember, to understand, and realize that as followers of God, as you take your walk with the Lord seriously, you're going to get pushback. And there's going to be some skirmishes that you experience. There may be some fights. I don't mean necessarily actual fights, but there may be some tense experiences that you wind up being on the receiving end. But I want you to understand that you don't have to, and it is not incumbent upon you to fight about every jot and tittle. Not every hill, the cliche tells us, is worth fighting for. Not every hill is worth dying on. There are, however, some essentials that as a follower of Christ that you can't compromise on. Now, is God real? Absolutely, He's real. And if the question is, hey, you either publicly announce that God is fake or die, well, then choose death. But whether or not Larry agrees with me or not, effectively is irrelevant, isn't it? Because ultimately, I'm not going to answer to Larry one day. I'm going to answer to the Lord. So it was prudent that that wasn't their chopping block that they're willing to put their head on. And they weren't willing just as an example to risk their lives just to demonstrate God's power, but they were willing to give their lives when the question is, are you going to worship something other than God Himself? That's an essential. And we need to have prayerful discernment as we are operating in a culture that's pushing back to make sure that the stuff that we're fighting for, or even fighting about, and standing for, and risking who knows what, we need to make sure that that stuff is in the essentials category. I have known somebody who was like this. I don't know if in your life, I hope you're not in this category. Certainly nobody I know in this room is. But maybe you have known someone who does something like this, who takes any type of negative comment or any type of pushback and inflates it. So, for example, this is a completely random example, but so if you were to say to him, you told me that you were going to be here at 4, but you didn't get here till 4:30. That's not that big a deal, is it? You just say, oops, my bad, I'm running late. Sorry, maybe we misunderstood. I thought we'd agreed on 4:30. That's not how he would operate. What he would do, and maybe not to that person, but maybe to me, would say, I can't believe that they were calling me a liar. I mean, they were essentially saying that I said I would meet them at 4, and I know that I didn't say. I know I said 4:30. They're essentially calling me a liar and calling into question my integrity. Is that accurate? No, they were just saying, I think you're 30 minutes late. But he had a unique gift of inflating and making really big something that really wasn't. And when that happens, when you do that, you can wind up putting your head on some chopping blocks it shouldn't be on. Does that make sense? Let me give you an example. You have heard as well. There's been stuff that you've seen online. I've even heard it from preachers' mouths with respect to everything that's been going on concerning the pandemic. There have been those that have been talking about the flagrant religious persecution that has been going on and the persecution that the church has been and Christians are experiencing. Let me say this before going further. I believe that there have been some singular instances where churches in particular areas might have been unnecessarily singled out. But when I have heard people talk about the religious persecution and all the suffering that we are experiencing, I just want to say, oh, give me a blessed break. Are you kidding me? I mean, do you want to say, for example, to the people who died as followers of Christ under Nero's order, to die being burned alive, attached to the stake, that somebody said that you can't meet in person and groups no more than this size, that's actual religious persecution? What I want you to understand is that what we have been experiencing, and I think a lot of times it's well-intentioned. I think that the intent behind it was, by and large, positive or at least neutral. But I think with respect to everything COVID-related, what we have experienced is an epidemic of illogical reactions. And I don't want to continue to expand significantly on this, except to say, I believe there's been a whole lot of things that have been done that didn't make a whole lot of sense. For example, people have said, well, no, churches are being picked on, and this is persecution by the government against the church. Christians are being persecuted here. Let me just say, in response to that, Christians have been no more persecuted than bowling alleys. Because let me ask you this. If you can go into Walmart, or if you can come here, could you not, for example, if the governor had 6 weeks ago said, hey, bowling alleys can meet, they can still be, they can reopen for business, but we're going to limit the number of people, every other lane is closed, and you can only bowl with people in your household. Is that possible that they could have done that? Could that have been safely done? As safe as going to Walmart. As safe as coming to church. So why aren't we out there with our banners saying, down with the government for their mistreatment of bowling alleys? All I'm telling you is that there have been people that have been unnecessarily, that are wearing the Jesus jersey, that are on our team, that are unnecessarily inflating and unnecessarily characterizing what I think, truth be told, is just some illogical, well-intentioned but illogical responses. Make sure if you're going to put your neck on the line, if you're going to put your head on the chopping block, that it's one that's worth getting your head chopped off for. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. And it wasn't about whether broccoli is better than cauliflower. It was whether or not there is a God in heaven that we are going to worship and bow down to Him alone. That's an essential thing. And they said, we're willing to die for that, even if He doesn't rescue us. I got to hustle. All right, next thought is this. The endurance of a trial can speak louder than its description. The endurance of a trial can speak louder than its description. All right, so hearing this, verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar is filled with rage. And it says even the expression on his face changed towards these guys. And you can kind of see it, like, I mean, he's gone from just normal, maybe it is blood red, or he goes just pale. And have you ever gotten so mad that you kind of quiver? I mean, and it has happened to me where somebody has done, and you kind of feel shaky. I mean, it happens so instantly. I think that's how Nebuchadnezzar responds. And so, according to verse 19, he gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he commanded some of the best soldiers, which is to say some of the strongest guys, the biggest guys, to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. I'm serious about that. He took this as a personal affront. They have spit in my face is what they've done. Boy, you are going to, well, you're really going to burn. So these men in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes were tied up and thrown in the furnace of blazing fire. All right, so a couple of things. I don't know about you. I've always kind of wondered, what exactly is that furnace, right? And what I know what a furnace is in my house. I know what a furnace is here, but like, I don't think that was. Robert, do you think there was an evaporator coil in that one? I don't. Probably not. So I did a little bit of digging, and based off some archaeological digs that have revealed some forms of these, it is believed that that this furnace would have been kind of milk jug shaped. And probably in part of a hill. So you would build it into a hill. There would be there'd be an opening down here where you would, let me put some heat in there, where the fire would be. And then there would be up here an opening that you could access. These existed of varying size, but these would have been bigger than you and I are. So you're probably, just imagine something 20, I mean from tip to tail, maybe 20, 30 feet, I don't know. That'd be kind of sizable. What might you do with a furnace such as this? All right, so you could use it for smelting. metal. What else would you use it for? In fact, we use a word for something like this. Starts with a K. A kiln. And what might you put in a kiln? Pottery. What else might you put in there? A pie that you want to cook in a hurry? Do what? Bricks. All right, think about this. It seems that, or let me back up. Can you imagine that there would have been readily accessible a big old, use the word kiln, I think that may help you. Can you imagine that there would have been a readily accessible kiln in that area? I think it's reasonable. Why would I say that? Correct, but has there been recent use perhaps of something like this? That statue, how big was the statue of Nebuchadnezzar? 90 feet tall. How many bricks do you think there are in a 90-foot structure? It'd be a lot of bricks. And instead of carting all of that, why don't you build one of these and go to the creek, dig some clay out, fashion them, and you in fact, we do that even now. I say we. The DMV, if they're doing like on interstate work, if they're doing, when they are doing massive concrete laying, like for example, when they went over the Yadkin River, they put up a little concrete plant there. I don't know if you ever noticed that, but they would, so that way they're not having to truck it in. They build it on site. It's likely that in the plains of Dura, there was one of these real close to where that statue was, because they needed to make bricks. What else do they need? What was the statue covered in? Gold. Well, how are you going to get gold on it? Just like spray paint it? No, you need to, what do you need to do with it? Well, you need to smelt it. If you think that means sniff, just close your Bible now and just... But you need to melt that down. So it is likely that this existed because the statue existed. And this is the... And in fact, think of the irony of that. The very oven that was used to bake and to craft essentially everything that was in this statue that they refused to bow down to, we'll cook you in that one. All right? So there's that observation. Do you think it's well, I think it has to be notable. Let me ask this. Why do you think it's notable that it's described that they had their trousers, robes, and head coverings and other clothes? Isn't that interesting? Do what? Yeah, but I think the text is intentional in communicating, hey, these guys weren't greased in some sort of flame retardant butter. I mean, they had clothes on, like, and not just a little bit, like the normal cover from head to toe, trousers, outer garments, undergarments, scarves, gloves, mittens, had everything. Because I believe that the thought is, and that it wants to be underscored, there is no reason that if someone clothed like that put into a furnace or a kiln like this, instantly that ought to go up. Have you ever tried to, like, for example, with a have you ever burnt dryer lint, like in a fire or something like that? I'm telling you, that it goes up like that. I believe the thought is, hey, they're going to be covered close so that you would think they're just going to be immediately consumed. And if all that if all that heat causes their clothes to catch fire, well, then certainly they are going to be burned to death. And think about, that's a horrible, horrible way to die. You remember ISIS, when they had massive control of significant portions of Iraq, they were doing this. I remember there was some Jordanian fighter that they shot down, and they burnt him alive. And the king of Jordan said that we're going to fight until we run out of gas or bullets. And but it was just a horrible death that they inflicted. Burning alive is a horrible, horrible way to check out of here. And so it's not simply that they were in this oven or going to be put in that oven, but what about the oven? We flip to broil, right? So not just twice as hot, not 3 times as hot, Let's make it 7 times hotter. Well, I don't believe that's an actual measurement. What do you think the thought is? As hot as you can possibly get this thing, that's how hot I want this thing to be. All right, so they're bound, they're tied up, they're tossed in. In fact, it is so hot, according to verse 22, that the raging flames killed those men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up. So the very people that are trying to get them in, they die from the exposure to the heat. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Now, with respect to something like this, where they were tossed in, I don't know. Could it be here? Possibly. Could it be here? Possibly. My suspicion is it's here. The reason I say that will make sense here in a second. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped in alarm. He said to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" "Yes, of course, your majesty," they replied to the king. And he said, "Look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." All right, so it makes sense. Why do you think I would say that they would have been tossed in here as opposed to like up near the chimney? Yeah, because you're able to see here, but you can't. I mean, think of all the heat that would be coming off of this thing. You couldn't dare look down into it. But if there's this opening up that's elevated, you're able to see. All right, so he says, wait a minute, hold up on that. We put 3 guys, they were bound. The people I see in there are not bound, but we put in 3, I see 4, and they're just kind of walking around. Houston, we have a problem. Besides that, the 4th one, the CSB says, looks like a son of the gods. I believe NIV. Anybody have NIV this morning? So I think the NIV says the same way, doesn't it? Does it say son of the gods? King James says, does anybody have King James? It looks like the Son of God. I won't bore you with technical details. Is it acceptable to translate that as the Son of God, singular? It's possible. Is it more likely? It seems that the consensus is no. It's more likely that he's talking about a son of the gods, which is how NIV, CSB, and some others, I think even New American Standard renders it this way. The thought is that Nebuchadnezzar looks and sees this 4th one, and he believes the 4th to be what? In some form or fashion. The 4th is what? Deity in some form or fashion. So, is it possible? And a lot of people have speculated. And understand this: at the end of the day, we just have to speculate, because it could be, it could not be. Could this be an angel? It could be an angel. Could it be more than an angel? It could be. What else could it be? It could be a pre-incarnate Jesus. So before, in fact, many have speculated, this is a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus himself, that he appears with them in the furnace. That when it's talking about like a son of the gods, no, this is that the Son of God. Is that possible? It is absolutely possible. That's where, and if you couldn't hear, the question was, how would they know what the Son of God looked like? That's where I think that you have to back up and say, well, what was Nebuchadnezzar trying to communicate? And the thought I believe he's trying to communicate is this: whatever that is, that's deity. All right, so that's what he sees. And forgive me, I'm trying to hustle to get this plane landed. Verse 26, he approaches the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called, and see, it says there, the door. Kind of makes sense. On the milk jug, we're not looking down in, we're through this entrance. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. And what was on these bodies? A whole stack of clothes. And not a hair of their heads was singed. I mean, you ever put, even cooking on the grill, some of you guys that look like me and are like part werewolf, I mean, you get close and you're like, oh man, and you got all this melted hair. There's none of that. Their robes were unaffected and there was no smell of fire on them. And the smell of smoke, how quickly does that get in your clothes? Whether it's from a campfire or from a cigarette or whatever, how quickly does smoke get? I mean, it's almost instantly. These guys don't even smell like smoke. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own." So he understands the reason. This is why they put their head on the line, is that they're not going to worship something that's not God. All right. The point I said just a moment ago is this: the endurance of a trial can speak louder than its description. As these three are brought out of the furnace, are they described as having said anything? The text doesn't tell us that they said anything. And I realize this is an argument from silence, but it's entirely possible they didn't say anything. Do you know why? Because many times, actions speak louder. In fact, sometimes they can even speak better than words. The fact that they came out of this, did this really need any explanation? It really didn't. As you experience pushback, as you get on the other side of it, simply having endured that can say and speak louder than your description of it. In fact, and I realize this fights against human nature, because what we like to do is whine and moan, don't we? We like to tell war stories. And that's true of all of us. We do. But sometimes just simply enduring it and getting through it. In fact, maybe even more, that you don't talk about it, that you don't wax on about it, says more than you're actually having unwound it and laid out the description. Bless you. I got two more, but these are going to go quick. Your endurance of trials should maximize God and minimize you. Your endurance of trials, my endurance of trials, should maximize God and minimize you. In verse 28, it says, as Nebuchadnezzar, he can't believe what he's seeing. He says, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel," and I'm inserting the word he, "and he rescued his servants who trusted in him." Who is being celebrated here? God's being celebrated. Why is God being celebrated? I think in part because it's likely that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't telling their war stories. They have experienced this trial. They have been through this pushback. They have been actually in the furnace. They've come out of this. That says something significant on its own without them adding anything to it. And he winds up, is he praising Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? No, he's praising God. And ultimately, that needs to be the desire of our heart, that if I am his follower, he's greater than me. He deserves attention. He deserves, especially when he's at work. I mean, because they didn't say themselves, God did this. So he ought to get credit for this. And so they're not acting in ways that would detract from that. You and I also need to be intentional in making sure that as we experience trials, that as we go through them, the aim should be, the goal should be that we maximize him and minimize us. The last thing is this: do not insist on a particular preposition. Do not insist on a particular preposition. All right, so Darnell is our English teacher here. She has talked and taught many times about a preposition, right? So what Darnell, help everybody remember from English, what is a preposition? Well, and it typically modifies what? Yeah, but most of the time, it typically modifies a noun, which is what? PPT. A noun typically is a person, place, or thing. All right, so you can see that this is a compound word. It's got two components. What does pre mean? So it means before. So before position about person, place, or thing? Is it coming back to you? What does a preposition do? What does it tell us about a person, place, or thing? It tells us position. Right. It identifies where a person, place, or thing is or will be. When you or I are experiencing trouble, you know this to be the right answer. You ought to call on God. As you are experiencing difficulty and adversity, as you go through your own personal furnace, absolutely, it should be that you and I are calling out to God and saying, Lord, help me, rescue me some way. Let me ask you this. When we are asking God for help, there's a preposition that we tend to use. Or even if we don't say it, we're typically asking. Do what? Well, not if. Let me get, all right, so. Well, more often than not, what do we want when the heat gets turned up? What do we want? What do we want the heat to do? We want it to stop, right? So even if we don't say it, what are we most of the time trying to say? Help me. Yeah, we'd probably say out of this trial. So it may say even deliver me what? We would say what? From. And so in that case, from means out of. God, I'm sure you remember, Lord, those old cassette decks that where you would press the eject and the tape comes out. Could you do that with this? I want out of this. Is that a reasonable request? Sure it is. Is there any problem with asking that? No. But here's what we have to all tell ourselves. Do not insist on that preposition. Because it may be that God is going to help you, that He is going to rescue you with respect to the trial, not out of or from, but what's the preposition that God may use? Through. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't get out. They got through. I think we need to remind ourselves that most of the time, how is it that God works in our lives in trials? Is it out of or through? It's through. It's through. In terms of application, as you pray, there's nothing wrong with saying, could you press the eject button? But in the end, the prayer needs to be, God, I need you to help me. Either help me out of or help me through. I just need your help, and I'm okay with whatever you do. Because when that's the case, I promise you, God will come to help you, and He will absolutely get you through it. And He'll do so in ways that make a big deal out of Him, that maximize what He's done, makes a little you and a big Him. And we need to be okay with that. Does that make sense? We are going, you are going, all of us, the extent to which we take our walk with the Lord seriously, there's going to be pushback. You can brace for it when you know some things. Just to put it together at the end. You've got a friend in Jesus, but maybe nowhere else. Know which chopping blocks are worth your head. The endurance of a trial can speak louder than its description. Your endurance of trial should maximize God and minimize you, and don't insist on a particular preposition. All right? Pray with me. Father, thank you for giving us this chance together this morning to spend some time looking at your word, and I pray in many ways that we're able to see ourselves in it. Maybe not what is, but what could be or should be. And maybe there are some actually in this room that are experiencing, or somebody that's watching online that's actually experiencing some real pushback because of their commitment to you. I pray, Lord, that the lessons of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego mightn't be those simply, not simply that we learn and are familiar with, but the principles that we live and live out. Because when that happens, it makes a big deal out of you, a smaller deal out of us, but it gets us through the difficulty. Thank you for speaking to us today, and we say it in Christ's name. Amen.